Okay. Okay, we're going to start a little early today, but welcome to Wednesday office hours. Um, now I, of course, put the wrong date in for some reason. Uh, I will switch it back. I'm sorry to say. Kind of a month off. Um, Needless to say, to understand Karl Marx's theory of prices to production and the famous criticism leveled against it, we have to look at the transformation problem found in Volume 3 of Capital. The debate centers on how Marx reconciles the law of value, where goods exchange based on labor time, with the reality of capitalism, where goods exchange at prices that allow for an equal rate of profit across different industries. So the whole question of value versus price is going to come up at some moment because this value issue, um, the issue of labor time, um, etc., in contradistinction to capitalism itself, where goods exchange at prices that quote unquote allow for an equal rate of profit across different industries. So there is this sense of, as Fred Mosley will talk about, totality that kind of surrounds this sort of issue. And we'll see this go further on. And so this is kind of the schematic for this, and or the outline or the précis for this. And it may seem relatively simple. The things have a certain amount of labor associated with it, and they have, because they are, they deal with humans, etc. They have a certain kind of value. And yet in a world that a socially constructed communal interdependent world, there are things called prices which aren't identical to value. um, or are they? And so there's this larger sort of framework of thinking about how everything sort of fits together or is complete or seen as whole in that particular way. Now, the fact is, of course, if you think that way, you begin to already kind of reify it. It begins to become more static. So one should get a sense that no, it's much more fluid. It's like it flows. It's like, the universe, etc. And so, but reconciling that within the context of economics or political economy is a whole separate question, and much ink has been spilled on trying to differentiate various things, worrying about, was it something that Marx said, or was what Marx said viable in that particular context? And then you have to consider that there's an entire uh, tradition or competing points of view that defend a variety of positions on this for a variety of different reasons. In some cases, they are, as I've tried to point out using a variety of other methods, that um, that that it may be the case that, is it more qualitative or quantitative? Are there, do you commit to a labor theory of value or a value theory of labor, which is kind of an interesting turn of phrase, but these are kind of larger questions, and you just sort of have to sort them out. But understanding that there are historical traditions, and a couple of these ideas have gone on for a century, literally a century of cogitating about this. And so, within the context of this, I'm going to explain, not necessarily all today, but um, as we go through what I consider to be a major text, not the major text, God knows there aren't any, of how we can approach the problem with all of the different things that attend it to. And one way of doing this, not the way of doing this, it is another magnum opus. It's a different magnum opus. This is the one for Fred Mosley, as opposed to Anwar Sheikh. So I've been talking a little bit, and you'll see further down the page here that there is an issue of that Anwar Sheikh has a certain point of view that is classical political economy, and that as and reconciling it with a kind of Marxist tradition, which is a kind of political position that has occurred for decades. That is to not talk about Marxism as some sort of relatively autonomous thing, but rather fitting in or sitting within the context of a classical political economic position, which has all of its own little issues, whether it was or wasn't acceptable relative to Cambridge, um, that is Cambridge, England, and other issues about the whole issues underlying concept of capital, right? Now, in capital is a construct of a certain kind that can be also considered equally problematic. I mean, in the sense of, well, you know, you can hypothesize the Capitalocene as opposed to the Anthropocene and those kinds of things, which is all kind of nice from a metaphorical or linguistic sort of way. But in reality, we have to get on to what it really does mean. And does it mean the same things that Marx was observing and that are there, that are part of the larger story, but are problematic when you start to try and either measure things or create, as I've tried to point out here, the difference between, or as a critical realism might say, is, you have to differentiate between kind of deductionist kind of points of view versus causal explanation, and that's could be a false dichotomy as well. What we're trying to do is get more explanatory power. What we're trying to do is have a methodology that allows us to see causality, connection, um, interdependency, identification. All of those kinds of things are all part of this issue, and that it's not controversial, nor is it contradictory, nor it is dialectic. And I think if you can sort of hang your hat on the larger dialectic project, then you don't really have a problem. But if once you start getting sort of tied up in other kinds of problems related to dialectic, that is dialectical materialism versus things that aren't quite dialectical material and whatever that might be. And I mean, and you can go back as I think you'll see in some of those literature that it goes back to pre-sophists and et cetera, a whole other kind of a different kind of philosophical classical discourse. So anyway, so I'm going to introduce uh, something done by a Russian economist who died very young at the age of 28, but who raised the kind of philosophical question that underlies a lot of questions that were raised much more recently in the post-war period. He died in the 20s in Russia, but as an academic, as a scholar, he actually raised some of the questions about transformation that are worth thinking about. More specifically, or in his particular case, um, the issue of conjuncture. So we're going to sort of scratch the surface on this and probably cover this for a while. I will do a couple of things where we'll sort of work through this, but this will build on several different texts. Um, uh, this book called The Capitalist Cycle, um, capital and a kind of a totality. That's the other Mosley's work, Marx and totality. And you're going to need to sort of work through that as well, because even to assert a concept of totality automatically has to tons of baggage that aren't, it's not problematic baggage. It's more like what they force you to carry when you work in a casino. That is clear plastic purses, etc. Anyway, so let me go through the outline here, and then we'll start going through kind of some of the framework of what we're going to look at. Where we're going to look at Mosley's work. You're going to look at this little relatively obscure piece done during the kind of pre-Stalinist period, or or the early Stalinist period, the pre-purge period, that shows that, and it's not the only instance of this. There are entire disciplines during the pre-Stalinist period that are really important, and that and Western Marxism, or these so-called Western Marxism, the thing that Rockhill might critique as being not anti-imperialist enough Marxism, or whatever you want to call it, the anti-Stalinist kind of Marxism, that you sort of need to get a sense of what that vital period is, because in various fields in the Soviet Union, certain things that we might later on call humanist, or non-orthodox, or anti-orthodox, or heterodox ideas were sort of floating around, and they all get screwed up for all variety of reasons and in a variety of fields. I mean, from in an art point of view, abstraction gets tossed aside for socialist realism. Um, Psychology gets screwed up. You could even argue that Lysenkoism is kind of version of that kind of problem, but that's a whole nother set of stories. So, needless to say, there's other issues at work, and we're not going to solve them all here, but we're going to look at this one uh, problem, a continuing problem, one that some people, like Mosley, will say, uh, kind of, we don't have to worry about it anymore, or we what one needs to do is attain a certain enlightenment about all of the different factors that would cause you to worry about a transformation problem, and not worry about it so much, and look at it in a variety of other ways, which more contemporary literature has tried to attend to, or perhaps ignore in useful ways, and the deflection goes into certain other kinds of directions that are, one could argue, totalizing, or non-totalizing, or anti-totalizing, or post-totalizing, however you want to talk about it. For example, ecological discourse does some of that, and it does the heavy lifting, because you don't have to kind of, you know, uh, uh, wage a kind of philosophical warfare on how to get to the right kind of correct position on things. So, and without falling into kind of an ideological trap, which I would assert does happen in certain other venues, but in this particular case, and in the case of trying to solve at least one of the larger issues of the things I'm fiddling around with, and that is, how is it that we can have information without being accused of working only in the epiphenomenal, or working anti-materialistically, and that to see that there are viable ways of solving some of those kinds of problems without um, a lot of mental gymnastics, perhaps a lot of sort of weird contingencies, which are not so problematic, but you'd have to put a little work in to get it so that people won't they have no objections to it, or that it has a kind of logic. Even that alone is a kind of interesting question, whether there is a logic for it, and whether it is a logic that works, kind of ecumenically. I think that there is an ecumenical point of view on it. Anyway, So Marx's original framework, Marx argued that in a competitive economy, capital flows to wherever the rate of profit is highest. Now, this migration continues until a general rate of profit is established. Now, a general rate of profit even is, kind of this other question. And then you have to ask the question of rates of profit versus other kinds of things relative to capital. And then you have to sort of plug in, a rate of profit versus interest at, when you get down to the applied details, and capital accumulation and a variety of other things, because you need all of those little things to help work through the issue of surplus, or the idea of surplus even before you get to the question of surplus value. So anyway, to achieve this migration, commodities do not sell at their values, C plus V plus S, but at prices of production. Marx defined the price of production as price equals bracket C plus V bracket times bracket 1 plus P bracket. So the issue here, Marx maintained two invariance postulates during this transformation. And, you can write all this down and say, well, this just sort of accounts for it and you don't have to worry about it so much. But as you can see in the literature, people spend a lot of time fighting with each other about this. And it took to a variety of theoretical positions that were interesting, arcane, in fact, but and probably useful for a variety of kind of a parallel research program or whatever. But it ultimately still doesn't quite answer certain other kinds of questions and doesn't reconcile some of the major critiques. The critique of uh, of so-called Western Marxism, post-war Western Marxism, and its variations, Frankfurt School, et cetera, critical theory, et cetera. So, total price, number one, total price equals total value, total profit equals total surplus value. So these two ideas are important. I mean, this is the essence of it, that things happen. The commodity is one way of talking about this kind of question, or mobilizes it and allows us to think about what happens after within this whole, mishigash, I suppose, that you can get to profit, some relationship between profit and surplus value. So now what we'll see later on here is that the Borkowitz Sweezy criticism, the Paul Sweezy and Ladislaus von Borkowitz, identify a fatal logical flaw in Marx's method. Now, this, we don't have to spend a lot of time on this, and I hope that, well, you can if you want, whatever. But it's a milestone, I suppose, that you have this moment in the early 20th century, that Borkowitz and then popularizing by Paul Sweezy, this so-called fatal logical flaw, under which you get Berkowitz pointed out that Marx transformed outputs into prices of production, but left the inputs in terms of value. So, you can see the argument is that if an industry sells its product at a price of production, the industry is buying that product as an input, must also be paying that price, not the value. And this may be just simply a semantic problem. And it's signified by a whole variety of other things like cost price and a bunch of other stuff, I think. But of course, what confounds people is the basic, it's the kind of arithmetic, Marx's kind of algebraic problem, and then looking at it farther, that's the kind of question that where you really do sort of want to get things in an applied way to get this to work out, the math. when you transform both inputs and outputs simultaneously using a system of linear equations, Marx's two invariance postulates, that is, total price equals total value and total profit equals total surplus value, usually cannot be true, both be true at the same time. Now, well, we'll look at various versions of this. So there's a proof. Berkowitz used a three-sector model, means of production, workers' goods, luxury goods, to show that Marx's math only balances if you drop one of his core postulates or make a highly restrictive assumptions. Now, if you believe at all in neoclassical economics, um, you know, neoclassical economics has this kind of set of issues that go on as well. They just happen to the restrictions happen in just simply other ways and in other kinds of a theoretical or research approaches that do make sense from a mathematical point of view, but ultimately, as we've seen in reality, that they don't quite work out when you see it fully articulated in under, for example, financialization. So now, so that without getting, we'll get back to this, I suppose, at some moment, and it is described by Mosley, so we'll get to it eventually, I suppose. It's in one of the later chapters of the totality book. So the defense against the criticism, Marxist scholars have developed several rebuttals to rescue the theory from the Borkowitz-Sweezy critique, and that is, and there a lot of ink was spent on this: the temporal single system interpretation, the TSSI. This is the most modern, most robust modern defense. TSSI proponents argue that Borkowitz made a simultaneous valuation error, that is, an issue about sequential logic, that TSSI argues that inputs are brought at one time and outputs are sold at a later time. Now, the defense of this is that the prices paid for inputs are already market prices, that is, prices of production from the previous cycle, and that actually makes sense. There is no need to transform them again. Under this temporal view, Marx's internal consistency is maintained, and both invariance postulates can hold. And that does actually make certain sense because, from a logical point of view, that you don't have to get into this sort of conundrum because people can't or don't think that it has this sort of multi-layered kind of way of thinking about circuits. There is, of course, in this same period, kind of in parallel, although one comes sort of, if there is kind of one comes before the other, or it becomes, it sort of develops in a kind of parallel condition, whatever. There's the new interpretation to Manil and Foley. Now, this approach redefines what is being transformed. That is, instead of trying to link every individual commodity's value to its price, it focuses instead on the net product. So, and you can see how this gets kind of screwed up when you begin to think about, and this is why people like Anwar Sheikh, etc., do spend time trying to work through how does this fit into actual data, particularly large-scale data, and particularly large-scale data that has, kind of dynamic significance. And so from a macro point of view, you do want to get this sort of work through slightly, even though you can see that it operates, and once you look at the discourse, you can see that some of it operates at kind of special levels under special conditions, as opposed to, you know, uh, anything that we could make fully universal and generalizable. And without going too far into the parallels to physics, as econophysics does, there are things in physics that have not been quite solved yet. Right? Gravity, certain gravitational issues that manifest themselves way far away and at massive scales. So that kind of stuff is still an issue, much of which, of course, has other kinds of problems. Well, is it an observational question? Is it, can we ever, kind of have a position on if, in fact, everything has been relativized, etc. So, anyway, the new interpretation defense is they argue that the total value created by living labor is equal to the total money value added. No, that seems okay. This preserves the link between aggregate labor time and aggregate price without needing the complex sector by sector balancing that Borkowitz demanded. Now you can see that Borkowitz wanted to work through this because it, it's just troubling and creates, it's ponderous, I suppose. Uh, and now that we have computers, this doesn't it's not ponderous anymore. I mean, it just isn't. And we should sort of say, okay, it was problematic then, not so problematic now, less problematic now, perhaps. And the fact that it is less problematic, uh, offers or opens the possibility that we can sort of move ahead from a theoretical point of view. Okay, C, the redefinition of value. Some argue that Berkowitz treated Marx's value as a physicalist accounting tool, like Sraffa's models, rather than a social relation. Now, this can get us into a real problematic area, but and certainly a lot of ink was spilled on these kinds of questions, particularly in trying to compare, uh, trying to develop a larger question of kind of production or productionist kind of points of view, underlying certain things that go on further that will actually become important when we get back into this, Carcetti, Passanetti, etc. So anyway, the defense. Marx never intended the transformation to be a mathematical identity of physical units, but a demonstration of how surplus value is redistributed among capitalists. So you can already see here the defense already is parsing out the difference between something that's more theoretical, um, or sort of metaphorical in some ways, and the kind of applied reality. So even if the math is messy in a static model, the social logic of profit seeking remains valid. So you can see if you look at a table as the AI has provided, not that this is, totally viable or absolute, but there's a difference among values, prices, in terms of points of view. That is, Marx Volume 3 Capital, has a certain point of view in, column 2 here, noting that there is we're talking about input, valuation, logic, and verdict, whatever, however you want to think about that. Needless to say, this is how AIs kind of organize this, and whether it's good or bad, we'll work through. Um, Borkowitz-Sweezy talks about simultaneous prices, whereas TSSI defense looks at it not simultaneously, but kind of serially or chronologically, and that's actually a big deal, from a math point of view, specifically. And ultimately, you can see that that can be an issue in trying to do, sort of econometric problems. So in row 2, logic, surplus redistribution, that's what Marx wants to do, is he wants to get to a point where surplus is being created and it does get redistributed. The problem is that redistribution is inequitable. And that's the key element that we've been always sort of thinking about, you know, uh, that drives some people to look at the entire sort of the big picture, Piketty, how do you sort of work through that? The issue of inequality or inequity and capital accumulation. So anyway, so Berkowitz-Sweezy thinks of it, and so many people think of it as a kind of equilibrium problem. and you can see a lot of ink was spent on this, people, and we've gone through this before, um, looking at the kind of Japanese approach, which sort of accepts certain ideas about equilibrium, among others. It's not simply Japanese, it's just simply there in the history of these kinds of issues, choosing equilibrium models was actually kind of useful and important because the math helped kind of looked consistent and shouldn't have been problematic, although I think people need to just sort of revisit it because of the problem of distribution. And of course, this other thing, the Kantian thing about how just is this distributional kind of question, which sort of impinges on the issue and allows us to sort of worry about it, as many people, whole bunches of different kinds of people worry about this, whether it's the moral question, the justice question, um, the whole, the misreading of this problem of equality and equity. It's not like we're all supposed to go out and wear, mouth suits or something. Um, and in TSSI defense, it is, you you can without getting into the math of it, a sequential process can have equilibria, associated with it, depending how you set things up. Now, verdict is consistent in the aggregate, and that's Marx volume 3 attempts to do that, does do that, and it's obviously incomplete for all of the historiographic questions, reasons for, when certain parts of volume 3 were written, um, and because they're not written sequentially, and there's other kinds of issues that go on there, and then of course the parallel production or the kind of intervention that occurs, the break that occurs in the middle of it or whatever that spawns theories of surplus value. So, and to reconcile that, as Engels tried to do, is maybe it doesn't quite work, or it does work because Engels sort of tried to make it work, and there are reasons to do it that way, and they're not bad reasons. It's just that it may not really have been what Marx wanted to do, but we can't really go there because for obvious reasons. But it the defense of it is um, still worthy, and you can see how that influenced a whole bunch of other folks trying to work through those issues, whether they were trying to be, sort of faithful to Volume 3, or whether they're trying to see Volume 3 in its context. That yes, it is fragmentary. Yes, it is, uh, you know, problematic. But as we'll see with the concept of conjecture or conjuncture, I'm sorry, conjuncture, that you can sort of solve some of these problems. That it's not as problematic, um, and you shouldn't have to sort of kind of demand too much from it in order to get it to be logically consistent. You can create a range under which these arguments can kind of work out. They can be consistent. They they can be consistent both internally and externally when you start seeing how it sort of folds out, sort of in space, which is sort of David Harvey kind of stuff. Um, because that kind of proves what it's not circular in that sense, but it does have certain types of logical consistency. So the Berkowitz-Sweezy question on verdict is that the logic is flawed. And yes, if you assume certain things, simultaneous prices, a certain kind of logic, it's never going to be logically, perfect. It will have problematic elements that does not disclaim the need to have a heterodox political economy. And so the TSSI defense is to win the battle at one level. That is to show that it is internally consistent, so you can begin to make other kinds of questions, answer other kinds of questions about, socially necessary stuff. Um, so that this may sound confusing, but I think you can see that at least the AI decided that it would try to winnow down these matters, and I would assert that they're not perfect, as you can see my sort of yammering about this. So there's that. So the first thing, and I've already spent video time on this, is this this article by Phases, and a very recent one, as you can see, um, on price value discrepancy in Marxist capital and its relevance for understanding oil. So it has three parts. I don't think part three has been written yet. Part two is available, and we may talk about that. The point being is that uh, you can see that this does have application. This does have certain, it's viable. It has certain viability in that particular sense. So we talked about this before. I went through. It does offer a kind of conclusion. Uh, Thus, not only price but value too can only be meaningful, be understood in processual terms. That is, the substance of value qua abstract labor is potentiality in becoming rather than actuality already become. So you can see that's kind of a little language issue there. I would add further, the supreme difficulty in Marx's theory of value is precisely how to conceptualize abstract labor as a relational substance, which is to say, how not to conceptualize value is merely relational, but as self-consistent across its manifold determinations, albeit dynamically rather than conservatively so. And that suggests this kind of other issues that, often the logic is one that's sort of, I don't know, polluted or over-influenced or constrained by thinking that you have to always get it to work, kind of work perfectly, and it doesn't always quite do that, particularly when you move from, thinking that you could always sort of separate stuff out and you can do static stuff, and that the static stuff gives you a sense of how the dynamics work, which is not always the case when thinking about micro foundations and stuff. So measurements of value, i.e. price, may very well not be independent of what they value, as Hodgson suggests, but the point is they still measure something, and that's kind of the underlying point, is that there is some viability in that. Now, this something is what Marx sought to uncover, do so without any of the arbitrary stipulations about market movements. See, that already makes it, kind of ugly, in terms as and Marx, thinks about this. So anyway, so to conclude part one, what has been argued is that Marx understood the relationship between price and value, not as that between real and ideal magnitudes of capital in a manner analogous to the classical political economists before him, i.e., and this distinction is problematic as well, because it automatically has a kind of a bias built into the question, that is market versus natural prices, which automatically is problematic. It's a certain kind of artificiality that and of course there's a whole literature for this, and yeah, we can argue the historical question as well, but without even going there, um, prices are composed of value, even if it is at the same time through price that value receives its necessary form of expression. You see, there's this sense that it's always price versus value, whereas you should think of it, sort of mutually or sort of interdependent in ways that it creates a system or a set of correspondences. And without getting into the too technical areas of it, this is kind of how um, certain versions, and not to get too far afield, certain versions of semiotic modeling deal, or set theory kind of deal with these kinds of issues that are not only conceptually interesting, conjecturally interesting, but conjuncturally conjunctural interesting. Anyway, The mystery left to unravel is, in turn, not only how it is that value comes to be produced by labor and realized by capital, but also how the substance of value comes to regulate through its discrepancy with the form of price, its own production and realization. So already, this may be stepping back into kind of weird relativism, but the fact is, it's much wider than this, and in fact, from sort of a kind of a numerical kind of way, or a real analysis kind of way, you have to sort of assume that is kind of really the way it happens in reality. As will be demonstrated in part two, unraveling this mystery has relevance not only for understanding the transfer of value between industries, i.e., of varying organic compositions of capital, and you can see how that might apply to fossil resource analysis, but also within industries, in particular, in my case, the oil sector. So, so I just made a lot of arm waving with this one first article, this phases article that is only a couple of weeks old, uh, and has a part two that we hopefully will get to. Uh, the references are all good. They're all good references, in terms of trying to figure out what Sweezy meant, Steedman. You can see that everything is sort of being addressed here, and this is quite current, and useful in terms of argument. And you can see that some of the footnotes here actually apply when we get to some of the more complicated stuff. So anyway. Sorry, I'm just scrolling down here to try and get to. So, what we're going to consider as a kind of a large scale undertaking for probably a couple weeks, maybe more, depending how fast we read, is Money and Totality, a macro monetary interpretation of Marx's logic and capital, and the end of the transformation problem. I, you know, I, it may be that there is a there's a ghost haunting totality, whatever. Never say never, I suppose, that in terms of an end to the transformation problem. The transformation problem gives us a certain set of issues that's really important ultimately. That is, what was or is, value questions. How is it that we can address them as some people like Heinrich do, or other people that, you know, they're still fiddling with this in either good or bad ways, and haven't sort of copped to the fact that it's not an issue that much. Uh, what's more of an issue is to sort of shift our focus to thinking about not so much the value question, but to think about other versions of this as represented by or manifested in money systems. The problem, of course, is that money systems, as we've seen with MMT and a variety of other things, that it kind of gets um, messed up or reified in itself, that it kind of goes, well, we're not Marxist, blah, blah, blah. We're just being post-Keynesians and blah, blah, blah. They're all kind of other little things going on that I think are noisy in this context. So my purpose here, doing this little thing, is to read with you or work through Money and Totality in its totality, all 400 some odd pages of it. So, the circuit of money, that at last is where Fred Mosley's new book, Money and Totality, comes on stage. Mosley is professor of economics at Mount Holyoke, et cetera, written blah, blah, blah. And Mosley says in Money and Totality that a Marxist analysis of the circuit of capital does not start with value as measured in labor time, which then has to be explained or transformed into money. A real capitalist economy starts with money and Marx's value theory also does. So, things are the problem, of course, is when you go to capital, you see that the explanation comes at the front end, and money doesn't give, money should come in at the front, but it comes sort of a little later on because he sort of Marx in his writing of volume one sort of wanted to get this commodity idea kind of working because it obviously was a kind of new idea that he had sort of punched into, over the decade or so or whatever of dealing with capital, that commodity becomes the more interesting overall concept. And it's not a problem, particularly when you look at money, that there is, money commodity. And so that doesn't really disrupt our analysis. It's just that some people get a little too um, fixated, perhaps, on what some of these things mean. So, anyway, a real capitalist economy starts with money, and Marx's value theory also does. From the capitalist point of view, money advance must be lead to more money, or forget it. M becomes M prime, right? It's amazing that we, can only get up to first 10 pages of Capital, or the first 10 pages of Mosley. Marx starts here, but sets out with a theory of value to explain how M becomes M prime. Now he expands this trite formula into M-C-P-C prime-M prime. That is, money M is advanced by capitalists to purchase raw materials and technology, that is, means of production C. Then money is advanced to workers for their labor power, hours, and skills in production P, right? LMLP, whatever, MPL, MP means of production, and LP labor power. At the end of the production process, a new commodity for sale is going to become produced, containing more value than before, that is C prime, and then which is sold in the market for more money, hopefully that was originally advanced M prime. So money makes more money, but through exploitation of the workforce and the private appropriation of surplus value in the sale of the commodity. So the algebra is fine from that point of view, and particularly in the history of the history of this algebra, uh, and it shouldn't be that controversial, but it has become that way. So this brings us to one of the key insights of both the book, the Marxist theory of value, and its analysis of the laws of motion of capitalism as a macro-monetary theory. Now, even that configuration can be, problematized, but we won't go there quite yet. There is one real capitalist system advancing money in order to make more money, namely a profit, a surplus of value. Now, over the money, that is, or value in labor time paid to the workforce and for the means of production value contained in constant capital. Now, we do not start with a certain value of labor time or a certain amount of physical units of labor workers in technology and finish with that. We start with money and we finish with money. So what Mosley is doing is sort of capturing those issues that have been working in parallel in the post-war period, and confronting the lack, as it were, of sort of Marx on money issues that on the one hand allows you to not claim that you're a Marxist if you're an MMT person or post-Keynesian, which probably helps you out with a whole bunch of other things politically, in the workplace. But it theoretically, you sort of need to go back and say, well, fine, you know, uh, but it still has it's a classical problem. Let's put it that way. Is that you know money is still also a classical political economic problem that needs to be sort of addressed, and the lack of its full articulation or its lack of sort of attention in classical political economy sort of needs to be sort of dealt with, I suppose. Now, and we shouldn't trash Marx for not kind of working it through completely, uh, because he was just working with what he had, and so one always has to sort of cut Marx a little slack. the issue, of course, when you start talking about Marx, etc., is people have all this baggage floating around, and it just it shouldn't be that problematic. What is problematic, of course, is that there are certain things that are much more universal, whatever that means, and that is, for example, or ubiquitous, things like money. So, yes, beneath the process of money making money, we can show that this happens through the exploitation of labor, and the amount of exploitation or extra money made can be explained by the appropriation of surplus labor time beyond that needed to keep workers alive and in production. Thus, money is value, or the form of value that we see. So even this little summary has a kind of problematic element to it, although I think this is, Roberts' conclusion, but is really probably the best in terms of current sort of thinking about this. This is a worthy claim or proposition. Thus, money is value, or the form of value that we see. This mostly shows, though so thoroughly and clearly, Marx's value theory means that the total amount of money in an economy, excluding the impact of inflation and short-term fluctuations, matches the total amount of value socially necessary, abstract labor, as measured in time. So it means that the total money, including all of the stuff, matches the total amount of value. Money matches value. So total prices of production are equal to total value, and total money profits in this one world economy are equal to total surplus value in labor time. Value explains money. Surplus value explains profit. Now, already we're at this point. I mean, it's a point that, you might not want to admit has problematic components of it. So if you were looking at this at this particular sentence as a critical realist, you could say, well, that's fine. It defends a kind of more qualitative point of view of thinking about the problem, but does it do anything for sort of research programs, empirical work? Uh, it's not. And yes, it could be deductive. It's not deductive. It's more inductive, obviously. But you sort of want to think about where it sits in kind of the constellation of ideas, but particularly since this is the kind of issue that gets always screwed up by a variety of people who want to claim something is orthodox, something is heterodox, something is revisionist or reformist, et cetera, et cetera. Because at some moment this is going to become a problem, not fully a big problem, considering that the objections that people like Rockhill have with the Frankfurt School may not even impinge on this, considering that the political economy that underlies, Frankfurt Critical School stuff and its successors doesn't fully address this issue, even though you could say that there is a spirit of the heterodox that sort of operates in that history, and that history has not been fully articulated, and it's only because the kind of academic balkanizing that goes on. So anyway, from macro to micro, this is a macro theory, as mostly explains, which looks at the total economy. And when we go to the below the macro aggregates and consider individual prices of production for different products and individual profit rates for each capitalist, then values in labor time do not match prices. And a lot of ink gone there, right? The great classical economists, Smith, Ricardo, Stewart, and others recognized that commodities produced should be valued in labor time, or the labor expended overall in an economy. They had serious flaws in their versions of the labor theory of value. And as I think if you've been hanging out with me far enough, that we can see that this has become, there's a lot going on here that is problematic, because you begin to think about the kind of nuances that underlie this about labor power versus labor, wages versus work, blah blah blah. David Ricardo thought individual prices had to match individual values in labor time. Adam Smith thought that prices were made up of inputs in value from separate factors of production. profit, that is value from the capitalist, wages, value from labor, and rent, value from land. Now, all that makes some sense in the classical sense because you sort of needed to get these things sort of figured out in order to get the logic to work. Where this breaks down or becomes problematic is that, Marx is going, all right, we got to, sort this out. And that's why you get to this kind of place, this funny little place that it's the middle period, perhaps, of the development of volume three, that you have to sort of work through this stuff. And to that point, Marx goes to, write this other stuff called theories of surplus value that sits around in its relatively autonomous place. And it's not ever, or perhaps not ever, and that's kind of why this Russian stuff is interesting, is not fully reconciled, with the kind of other things that are going on, that kind of impinge on that weird little period where theories of surplus value gets written. Anyway, but Marx solved this issue of the macro to the micro by showing that because individual capitals compete amongst each other, as a result, sectors with higher profitability get invaded by other capitalists seeking to increase their profitability. In doing so, profit rates tend to be equalized between sectors, as Marx showed. This did not change the overall value created in an economy, but merely redistributed the surplus value over and above the cost of capital, advanced from less efficient capitals to more efficient ones through the equalization of profit rates across sectors. This transformation solution was a brilliant one that Marx was very proud of. Marx's analysis of capitalism and capital was generally ignored by mainstream economics. Now, because there's a certain assumption, and some of it is definitional. I think that, there's some kind of lexical problem that doesn't get fully. Well, this should be left up for historians of political economy, or political economic thought. So, but anyway, but when attention was paid to it, it was attacked immediately. Von Bauer, and the Austrian school, and yes, I have a negative position on the Austrian school only because, it's become distorted or manipulated or co-opted by, a variety of folks. But I will at some point probably reconcile with it at some other moment. But the fact is, the choice of Austrian methodology tends to have this other kind of Koch brothers, whatever thing going on that makes it problematic. So, launching the argument that Marx's theory of value was contradictory because it assumed that total prices equal total values in volumes 1 and 2 in capital, but that prices of production were not equal to value in volume 3. So, how can prices be both equal to value and not equal to value? So, as Mosley comments, quote, Bauer did not understand Marx's logical method of the two levels of abstraction, that is, the total economy and individual industries. In Marx's theory, total price equals total value, but individual values equal prices of production. And that seems unproblematic, but some people just go nuts over that for a variety of, in some ways, it's a translation problem. In some other ways, it's a way that some people don't want to consider for a variety of reasons. That, it's all macro. There should be no micro, or that micro, or if in an alternate universe, micro foundations are still important, and there's literature for that. There is no contradiction with Marx's logical structure of the two levels of abstraction. That's kind of, where one should be, and not get into a kind of, dueling match that never quite resolves itself. And this conclusion is the first overriding merit and insight from Mosley's interpretation of Marx's analysis of capitalism, a brilliant insight that is Mosley's, although it had forerunners in the work of Roman Rozdalsky, Paul Maddock, David Yaffe, as Mosley attributes. The logical approach of Marx is to look at the macro first to show how money makes more money, and then look at the micro to see how that extra money is distributed among many industries and capitals through competition and the equalization of profitability. And if you recall, under neoclassical economic pedagogy, it's the other way around. And it's it's fine. I mean, you can learn it that way, but when you sort of invert it, no different than when Marx sort of thinks about, well, maybe I should use commodities to organize these ideas first, and then we can talk about capital in a much broader or more interesting way. Anyway, the more efficient get a transfer of value from the less efficient through capitalist competition, but profits come from the surplus value generated by the labor force employed in the whole economy and appropriated by capital as a whole. So, you know, the more efficient get a transfer of value from the less efficient through capitalist competition. But profits come from the surplus value generated by the labor force employed in the whole economy and appropriated by capitalists as a whole. You see, should not be controversial to exist in parallel. All right, realistic single system mostly shows that Marx's analysis is based on a realistic view of capitalism. Note that this argument about quote unquote real capitalism is actually pretty important to some people, like Shake, for example. There's a real and it may not be the actual capitalism. So that there's a whole nother set of issues there. Anyway, the circuit in motion of capital starts with money and finishes with money. Now, that should make all MMT people, very excited and happy. It's not so much about the money. It just simply is the point of view. It's just a different, as Rick Wolf might say, it's a different entry point problem. But anyway, it does not start with value, that is labor time, or with physical things, that is labor and means of production. So it's not about sort of abstracted things that end up as value or things. So it does not need value or things to be converted or transformed into money. See, this is the essence of the transformation problem. There are not two states of capitalism, one with values and one with money or prices. Marx's view is a single state system. Now, recall, of course, the little diagram that I showed before of TSSI. TSSI is a set of conditions under which you can have this sort of work. And that's not contradictory. It's just simply an aspect, a slice, as it were, of the kind of view, a synchronic, perhaps in that sense, which would be totally appropriate for a temporal single system, is so there's no mistake or logical contradiction in Marx's explanation of the transformation of values into prices, the so-called transformation problem of values into prices, and money does not exist. Why were we bothering with this in the first place? And there's probably a literature for it. I don't know quite what it is. I think it is. I suspect it is there. I just haven't gotten to it yet, I suppose. Is that much of this has turned on kind of translation problems, coding, whatever. These are kind of it's kind of important to get through that, because otherwise you get into this whole other kind of thing that distorts issues talking about estrangement, alienation, appropriation, all those things. Get screwed up when you begin to kind of say, well, you do it because values are more represented, and I'm just stating this off the cuff, values are more ideological, let's say, than prices, which is not true. You could configure it the other way around. It's just that nobody does that, or few people do that, because they don't sort of understand that it's all mediation in that particular point of view, from that particular point of view. So anyway, the mainstream critiques of Marx's analysis make the mistake, deliberate or not, of arguing that Marx had two logical analyses, first based on values, which had to be transformed into prices. They say if you start with inputs of labor and means of production measured in values, as they claim, the critics claim that Marx does, surely you must convert these values into money prices. And if you do so, then if you use simultaneous equations, you find that total values no longer equal total prices, and or total surplus value no longer equals total profit. This is all, as I said, this is the problem of the kind of constraints on the argument. That is because your original inputs and value will also be converted into prices. Yeah, because that's true. So Marx's analysis is thus indeterminate or logically inconsistent. Now, let's just stop there and say, this is, the problem of addressing the logic at one particular kind of juncture, but this is the conjuncture kind of question. And this is like using the macro argument to solve the micro problem and vice versa. That's oversimplifying it, but that is kind of at work. So this is the kernel of the critique first pronounced by Ladislav von Bortkiewicz in the early 20th century, the most frequently cited justification for rejecting Marx's theory over the last century. The critique was enthusiastically adopted by mainstream economics as finally crushing Marx's value theory of capitalism. It was accepted by hosts of Marxist economists like Paul Sweezy, many of whom spent many years trying to reconcile Marx's mistake with a theory of capitalism or looking for alternative interpretations of value theory, a long 100-year detour, as Mosley describes it, and as I've described it before, is that you spend, I mean, it's probably worth all that thinking about it and writing about it, getting tenure for it, whatever, but not so in that sense. But anyway, in the post-war period, so-called neo-Ricardian Marxists reverted to a version of Ricardian theory, namely that value was determined by the labor time as measured in physical production. And you can see where that can go, right? You can start measuring it. You can see that the Italians might get into it relative to operaismo, et cetera, et cetera. Either money played no role, or that there was a money theory of capitalism, that is prices, a money theory of capitalism, prices, and a value theory of capitalism, that is the physical things themselves, but the two could not be reconciled. That's just easy. It may be lazy, in fact, to simply dichotomize it in that way, but in fact, you can. Just because you can doesn't make it a good thing. So anyway, indeed, one consequence of this correction of Marx and the neo-Ricardian von Bortkiewicz model was that money was tacked onto the capitalist system as a separate department of production, that of gold. Now, you see, this is where the argument is problematized. It's problematized for all kinds of reasons. The fact that Marx talks about gold and reserves a certain place for it relative to money. And now Marx was just writing the history of this. He's not saying that that you should go run out and be a medalist or whatever, but some people actually take it in that kind of direction and use it to go in problematic directions. So you should sort of think about this in other ways. You could even think about it, in ways that are more standard money and banking kind of approaches to this issue. Obviously, we're much more complicated these days, and of course, financialization, et cetera, just becomes really kind of anachronistic and stupid. But so the value of money changes. Oh, in doing so, the price of gold, and thus the price of money under a monetary system based on a gold standard diverges from its value. It does. So the value of money changes, further complicating and confusing the connection between value and price. Another mistake of Marx, according to these critics. You see, this is a bad set of assumptions on the front end, and sort of it's you sort of say, well, he didn't have a good sense of currency and credit debt stuff, and you know that just because he didn't have it didn't mean that his theory doesn't quite apply to that. it does, in fact, imply, as Mosley does, I would assert, that money is important, more important, because of this abstraction or lack thereof relative to gold. So, anyway, and you can see how it gets distorted and that Austrians can go run probably to the wrong place on that kind of stuff. But anyway, but Mosley shows brilliantly that this is nonsense. Gold as money has no price of production and surplus value is not distributed in and out of the gold industry into other sectors. Now, this is an argument under capitalism, not an argument that you might make under feudalism. So there's a other thing going on here that can make this kind of noisy, can distort the argument. But anyway, so total prices of all commodities in capitalist production still equal their total values. When gold acts as money, the price of a given quantity of gold, dollars per ounce, for example, functions as a money measure of the value of a commodity. Gold itself has no price, but merely serves as a measure of value. See, so this is, as I've been, yakking about, this is more of an indexical question. But it's been distorted because it has a certain, contiguity issues or whatever. So gold as money does not enter the equalization process of values into prices of production. Gold is already money, and at certain levels, it is. And there's this kind of sleight of hand that goes on, and that make gold bugs kind of mad or annoyed. And of course, you could actually use the same argument with a little bit of recoding with the problem of cryptocurrency. But anyway, that's another argument. As a result, money is the monetary expression of labor time taken to produce um, a physical amount of gold. Melt in the modern Marxist jargon, melt is not, affected by changes in the price of production because it is the measure of those prices. But if melt, monetary expression of labor time, changes, it will affect the prices of production because capitalism is a monetary economy. In a non-gold standard world, where money is just paper or units of account in a bank, melt, that is monetary expression of labor time, will also vary if the quantity of paper money exceeds the quantity of money as measured by gold. Commodity money, which is where we sort of started in terms of talking about chapter one in Capital, is that, if you recall the kind of sort of logical argument that Cleaver was making, is that commodity money is a certain step in the description of the commodity, trying to get from commodity to money to markets ultimately and to class struggle. So, ironically, as Mosley says, the end of the gold standard commodity money actually rule out the neo-Ricardian argument for the gold sector to be included in the equalization of profit rates across the economy. As money is no longer gold, the profit rate in the gold sector is irrelevant to the price of production in commodities in the neo-Ricardian model, which is the way it should have been. Marx's theory of money fits into a macro monetary analysis of capitalism. It is a real analysis, not a concoction by neo-Ricardian critics that tries to tack money on to the transformation of values into prices. But you could see why that would happen, because kind of Marx sort of, kind of implies that in book one, in volume one, that you sort of have to do that, sort of. I mean, Marx doesn't say it explicitly, but kind of implies it because of where he places his discussion of gold. But anyway, standard interpretation, the more Bortkowitz, Swayze standard interpretation, as Mosley calls it, culminated in its destruction with a seminal paper by the leading mainstream economist of the post-war period, Paul Samuelson, the great Paul Samuelson, the author of the major academic textbook. I don't know, what is it, 12, 18, whatever. I think I learned with volume with the 11th edition or something, maybe the 8th edition, who knows, I can't remember. In my days of college, Samuelson showed that if you started with two systems, one in values and labor time and one in prices, the labor values can be canceled out and Plato determination in the real world of prices then determined by the quantities of things produced and the demand for them, that is, supply, demand, Fisher, blah, 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 sort of all that stuff that you see in the standard text, and that in some ways confuse everyone. So, in summary, quote, in summary, transforming from values to prices can be described as the following procedure. And this is, Samuelson being, kind of snotty. Write down the value relations, take an eraser, rub them out, finally write down the price relations, and thus completing the transformation process. Now, that, it is sarcastic. But with all due respect, erasure, in this particular use of erasure at this moment, in this text, at this time, is actually quite deconstructive and quite useful. More useful than we think. So we can come back to that, but this erasure issue, it does need to be returned to, not simply because it's a kind of snotty version of Samuelson's position. Samuelson's sarcastic joke may have buried the standard interpretation, but his own mainstream theory of prices was equally irrelevant. What determines whether the price of a car is $20,000 or $2,000 supply and demand. But why 20,000 and not 2,000? Well, because the market says it is so. Revealed preference of individual consumers, brilliant. But that's not the truth in a more heterodox sense, because there's all these other institutional distortions that are even built in the positioning of this kind of statement. But as Mosley says, Samuelson was right on the standard interpretation. If you interpret Marx to have two systems of capitalism, one based on values in labor time or physical units, and another on prices, then you have to transform values into prices. But why bother? Values can be canceled out. Marx's value theory then becomes metaphysically unnecessary, like the concept of God. And as we know, people still believe in God, which is, much to our dismay relative to Christian nationalism. We can explain all in the universe without God, and God explains nothing. But what Mosley shows in the body of his book is that these standard interpretations, the misinterpretation of Marx's analysis, you see, that's the issue. He takes the reader carefully and thoroughly through all the competing interpretations of Marx's value and price theory, see, that's why Money and Totality is probably a good text to sort of start with. It kind of does what Theories of Surplus Value was kind of gonna do, but didn't. And the point being, of course, and this is where below the next article we're going to start to look at, is where reassessing the Grundrisse would have helped, and didn't help for some people because they chose to ignore it, even though it was sort of there. And that's even the more befuddling thing. And you could argue that, well, there were all of these other things going on, and people didn't want to, even though it kind of got discovered and translated and put in the archives, and so the Grundrisse has the kind of position for a variety of other reasons. But anyway, he takes the reader carefully and thoroughly through all the competing interpretations of Marx's value and price theory, starting with the standard interpretation as expressed by the theory of Piero Sraffa and Epigone of Ricardo. He shows not only that Sraffa's approach of looking at capitalism as the production of commodities by means of commodities, which is, kind of, this is it in invocation of it as the title of his 1962 whatever thing, seems Marxist, is unrealistic in the extreme. There's nothing to do with Marxist analysis of capitalism. It's a process of money capital trying to make more money capital. And without getting into a big thing, but that's kind of what was going on here, is that it's a Sraffa's analysis, like actually classical, a classical political economy plus or Marxism, is sort of expunges that out. Sraffa ends up with a theory that implies capitalism can go on producing more things from things without any contradiction or limit. The example of, and this is why it's important to fully luxury automated communism and all the AI stuff we fuss with. The example of automation shows that clearly. Marx's own theory shows that there is an essential contradiction in capitalism between the production of things and services on the one hand and the profitability of doing it for private capital on the other. That contradiction is much more real, explaining cycles of boom and bust, boom and slump, crises, and the eventual demise of capitalism as a system. While Strauss's theory implies the universality of capitalism, Marx argues for its specificity. You can see exactly what that difference is, and that from a language point of view, it's a difference between, macro, micro, uh, 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 universals and particulars, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, it's all sort of there. The structure of the argument is there and useful. And, it's not our fault that, you have Passanetti and Carcetti and a bunch of other folks going in a certain direction via Sraffa. And that's not problematic. I mean, it is problematic from the point of view of trying to make some other kind of Marxist argument, but it's not problematic from the point of view that it has a certain structure. It's a useful structure. It may have limitations relative to the difference between um, ecological industries and pure manufacturing. So there's other kinds of issues that you sort of want to get to within that particular context. And it's not contradictory, not problematic relative to thinking about labor. It just means that you have to think about it in a slightly different way. So Mosley then shows that other interpretations, Anwar Sheikh's iterative way, and he spends time doing this, the new interpretation, the rethinking Marxism folks, all fail. They all fail to break with the standard interpretation. That's what I'm saying here is that, you sort of, oppressed by a certain canonical point of view that, uh, gets kind of tied up with the logical. It functions as a kind of de facto formalism in that sense. So all fail to break with the standard interpretation and thus cannot resolve the apparent logical inconsistency, the Bortkiewicz position, or the irrelevance, the erasure that Samuelson does of Marx's analysis. He goes into each with some detail with the reader to ponder, temporal or historic. Now, this is important because of the question of historical materialism underlying the kind of issue that needs to sort of be worked through. And this is why Mosley's book, it comes under kind of a historical materialist umbrella, because this is a kind of bigger thing that sort of needs to be worked through. And anyway, however, it's much more different with the temporal single state interpretation, TSSI. The essential points of the TSSI group of Marxist economists were summed up in another seminal work on Marx's analysis from Andrew Kleiman in 2007 with his book, Reclaiming Marx's Capital. Now, and I won't rehearse all of it, it's a big book, and there are certain assumptions in it that, Kleiman, it's fine. You just have to sort of worry about whether there are too many assumptions or certain points of view that haven't been fully articulated, but that's a whole nother story and worth arguing with relative to Kleiman's book. Those points were that Marxist theory is temporal. Money advanced for means of production and the labor force are the initial capital in time. Money advanced for means of production and the labor force are the initial capital in time. The production of commodities and their sale on the market, commodities to make commodities, come later. So we cannot impute simultaneous equations in the conversion of value into prices as the standard interpretation others do. That's kind of the demand, particularly when you think about how important it is to have, with all due respect, from a production point of view, sort of input-output, linear kind of model stuff. Anyway, second, Marx's theory is single state. It's not a question of converting initial inputs, that is, means of production and labor, into values as prices of production in the final commodity. That is, capitalists start with money, prices of production, and end up with money. But they end up with a different value or price of production, as explained by the exploitation of labor power, with its value ultimately measured in labor time in the whole economy. So that doesn't sound problematic. I mean, if you've done a lot of Marxism, you sort of say, well, yeah, not so bad. I single out TSSI from other interpretations because I consider that it did provide the breakthrough in refuting the standard interpretation by returning Marx to the logic and reality of a money economy. And I have been a strong supporter of this interpretation in the past, Roberts, whatever. Mosley agrees that TSSI made great strides in this task. However, he has two important disagreements with TSSI. He reckons it takes prices of production as short-term movements that change with each production cycle to equalize profitability within sectors. Mosley thinks that this cannot be right, as prices of production are predetermined over the long term by the productivity of labor, that is, the creation of new value, and the rate of surplus value in the class struggle, deciding the level of the real wage. This is where class struggle, comes back in. So prices of production only change if productivity and real wages alter. So prices of individual commodities fluctuate around a center of gravity. And this whole center of gravity thing is, problematic for all kinds of other reasons that don't necessarily get us to econophysics, but sort of get kind of warped by that, set by prices of production. Indeed, Mosley argues that unless his interpretation of prices of production as long-term centers of gravity for individual prices is accepted, then the two aggregate equalities, that is, total price equals total value and rate of profit equals rate of surplus, would not hold over successive production periods, thus defeating the very objective of TSSI. Now, we can get back to this. I think this is an unnecessary place to go for Mosley, but we'll get back to that. Second, Mosley disagrees that a temporal interpretation of Marx's circuit of capital means that the cost price, remember we started mentioning cost price of the advanced money capital for means of production and the employment of the labor force is fixed, and historic after production has commenced. So he reckons that if the price of equipment and other means of production changes after production starts, as it does, you can see where this goes, right? In terms of, constant and variable capital arguments, Marxian arguments. Anyway, it is still acceptable to upgrade the value of the commodity produced to include the current cost of the means of production, not the original cost. This is where cost price comes in. So it is not necessary or correct to use historic cost in the measure of cost of capital or the profitability of capital. So the historic cost question is, something that, well, anyway, the Australian Marxist economist Peter Jones, in a very interesting paper, attempts to reconcile the historic versus the current cost approach in the light of this debate. This is kind of deals with the things that I was mentioning before about the problem of other accounting measures that do change and shift and become problematized for all the usual kind of reasons, and then that are part of the kind of distortions that capitalism creates for itself. And without getting into a big deal, but I would assert that that's where all the corruption is. But anyway, Stern quote, current standard current cost measures of the rate of profit compare profits over the course of the year to the stock of constant capital at the end of the year. Kleinman's historic cost measure uses the stock of constant capital at the start of the year. I cannot see a good reason for either of these choices. Since profits are generated over the course of a year, a good measure of the rate of profit should take into account the changes in the stock of capital advanced over the course of that year. In both cases, you see, this is about accounting in some ways. The average rate of profit could roughly be thought of as an average of a series of snapshots of the rate of profit over the course of a year. So this is kind of where the conjunctural stuff will come. That this is why it is problematic, and a kind of conjunctural argument actually sort of fits this kind of thing, maybe. Now, this seems fairly close to Mosley's view on the subject. The latter point is very important in any empirical analysis of profitability in modern capitalist economies. Andrew Kleinman's view is that the historic cost measures must be used, and anything else is a distortion of Marx's measure of profitability. And this makes a difference when we try to measure the movement and the rate of profit. And see, this is where the big data gets really difficult. On the one hand, you sort of you have it available and you sort of should use it, but it is kind of GIGO and, garbage in, garbage out kind of. But anyway, Climate's measure shows a persistent fall in profitability of U.S. capital since 1945 without any significant rise, even during the so-called neoliberal period from the 1980s to now. That's a useful and interesting argument, and one that doesn't get talked enough about. The current cost measure, on the other hand, shows a trough in the early 1980s and a significant rise through to the end of the 1990s, at least, which is which is which is right. That is, which is right, has led to different views on the health of U.S. capitalism, the role of the financial sector, and what causes capital investment to change. However, perhaps the differences between the two measures are overdone because, as Dipankar Basu shows, over the long term since 1945, the two measures have tended to converge. Now, this is another kind of large, big number argument that needs a lot more work. Empirically verifiable. Fred Mosley has made a major contribution to a clearer understanding of Marx's method of analysis, showing that a Marxist analysis delivers with money prices and values integrated into a single realistic system of capitalism. Mosley shows that Marx had two stages of analysis or theoretical abstraction, which is what I was yakking about before. First, he analyzes the production of surplus value in capital as a whole. That's volume one and two of capital. Then he analyzes its distribution through the competing sectors of many capitals, volume three. Kind of duh, but some people don't like seeing it that way. And people don't, get kind of confused in volume two anyway. Marx starts with money. So there's no need to transform an underlying system based on value into a system based on prices. At the beginning of the circuit of capital, money capital is taken as a given or presupposed. So total value equals total prices in the totality. This is what the title of the book alludes to. Total value equals total prices in the totality. And all that happens with many capitals is that the extra value, that is surplus value, created in each sector will be equalized by the market so that the rate of profits is equalized, also tends to equalize across all sectors. Total surplus value equals total profit. Should be as easy as that. But the prices of production vary in each sector to equalize profitability across all sectors, and the whole circuit of capital is one that takes place over real time and is not completed hypothetically and simultaneously, as critics argued. You see, even to presume or the result of the historical result of that it is hypothetical or requires a certain synchronicity or simultaneity is problematic in and of itself. But anyway, one implication of Mosley's interpretation of Marx's analysis is a macro monetary one that starts with money, finishes with money, is that it is perfectly open to, yes, empirical verification. There is a view among some Marxist economists, as eminent as Paul Maddock Jr., for one, that it is impossible to measure empirically a Marxian rate of profit on capital and use official price data to evaluate trends in modern capitalism. That's because value cannot be calculated from money prices in Marxist theory of capitalism as a theory. See, already, you're off the rails. We're left with just recognizing that Marx was right because of the very occurrence of exploitation. See, this is what people have reduced the argument down to, that crises happen, exploitation happens, it's screwed up. It's not simply that. This is a bit like saying that we cannot determine the existence of black holes. You remember what I was talking about, gravity. Black holes in the universe, because their mass is so great and gravity is so strong that nothing comes out of them. Well, we know there's other issues that go on in black holes, etc. So we can only tell that they exist because of the wobbles that cause another object in space nearby. Well, it's more than that, but anyway. But if we interpret Marx's as a single system, an actual capitalist monetary macroeconomy, then it's perfectly possible, with all the caveats of measurement problems, data to carry out empirical analyses to verify or not Marx's laws of motion of capitalism. It's perfectly possible to carry out empirical analysis to verify or not Marx's laws of motion of capitalism. Laws of motion of capitalism has its own kind of set of issues. Indeed, Marx did just that, as Tapia Granados reminds us in a forthcoming paper. In 1873, Marx wrote to Engels that he'd been racking his brains for some time about analyzing those graphs in which the movement of prices, discount rates, et cetera, over the years are shown in rising and falling zigzags. Marx thought that by studying these curves, he might be able to determine mathematically the principal laws governing crises. But he had talked about it with his mathematical consultant, Samuel Moore, who had the opinion that, well, it can't be done at present. Marx resolved to give it up for the time being. So you could sort of see Marx was thinking about this stuff, it's just that, he didn't have a computer or whatever to work through that. So times have moved on, and we now have lots more data and better methods of analyzing it. Tapia concludes, to develop scientific knowledge, quote, to develop scientific knowledge is to advance concepts that are useful to describe reality, to make testable predictions. That's a big issue. And to be ready to assess any hypothesis by contrasting it with empirical data. Phlogiston had not a place in chemistry, and economic crises of a fuzzy character shall not have a place in social science. So yeah, there's a whole phlogiston. I mean, I don't know how many. This I should read more on the phlogiston issue, but it is pretty clear that even if it had this weird place in chemistry, and it should not have had one, or that it is useful for analytic philosophers to argue about this even now, it or use it as examples even now is sort of interesting. Well, anyway, as Michael Roberts says, who wrote this whole business, and this is why I like Michael Roberts, because I think he has his finger on the pulse of the problem. Um, Not only in his other writings, but because he does have a handle on both the theoretical and the empirical and other elements that are necessary. So I like thinking that Michael Roberts sort of represents kind of where we should be in generally thinking, with of course the kind of caveats that might be raised by people like Steve Keen, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, that's enough. I've been yakking far too long, but hopefully that there was tape. Hopefully there was tape, and hopefully someone listened to me. But this is worth reading closely, carefully, and this is a kind of that's why I wanted to use this particularly as a kind of précis to advance a kind of analysis of Mosley's Money in Totality text, but I wanted to compare it with the thing that we'll get to further on down here, and talking about in Masakovsky's Capitalist Cycle. He was the Russian I was talking about before. He died very young. Uh, but cyclical dynamics in capitalist economies, and this is a book translated by a fellow by the name of Day. And at some moment, this is all useful for discussing against or considering within uh, Mosley's book. Although I'm not sure that Mosley has enough to say about Masakovsky, and that kind of is left for us to sort of compare the two. I included this one little deal here from another paper that talks about the different. And this is oversimplification, of course, but you can see there are Kuznets cycles, other kinds of, you can think of this in the context of Schumpeter. And Kondratiev, because these are kind of the cycles issue, which is sort of referred to above in the sense of what we were left with was exploitation and crises. Well, we were left with more than that. You were left with, the kind of thing that Marx said. There's all these graphs and kind of zigzags, but I'm going to let this sit to our side for a while because it's really too complicated. And kind of we're at the point now where we can actually sort of work through this, although you need sort of a lot more scholars working on the problem, or at least to fuss with the problem to make it sort of empirically viable. But that's a whole nother story. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. The just a note, of course, that I put in other stuff here, uh, and they're not that difficult, but you can see that Bill Jeffries did a little article on this exact same problem, and I wanted to include it here to suggest that we needed to think about some of these things because they reflect on the exact same totality problem that Mosley does, the transformation of values into price of production in Marx's Grundrisse and Maksakowski's Capitalist Cycle. I put up a copy of Capitalist Cycle, I think, into Discord, and I hope that people will. You don't have to read it or think about it. It's not that it's a little complicated. What Masakovsky is doing in his text is like trying to reconcile uh, the kind of Marx's position with kind of conventional philosophy. It actually is quite lucidly written, or at least lucidly translated, and is actually an interesting little text for that point. So I started reading it, and then got sort of hung up on the fact that all this is well and good, and makes a perfect amount of sense, but is probably a reflection that uh, needs to be set in its particular historical condition, that the concept of a conjuncture um, is still useful, still viable. Although I think that we can actually see it kind of measured, if there is a way of measuring it, using a variety of other kinds of measures that are not problematic. They're just kind of different, that are the result of 100 years of thinking about this in a slightly different way. So anyway, and I said I'd stop, but I didn't, did I? So